The book of Habakkuk is like a prayer journal. Recorded are Habakkuk's heartfelt, emotional prayers. What Habakkuk is feeling, thinking, agonizing, he brings before the throne of God. And these things are what is recorded for us in this book, Habakkuk. Now, I don't know if anyone here keeps a prayer journal or if just from time to time you actually write down your prayers, or maybe you text them. But most likely as you write them down, you do not see on the page after you're writing God's answer. Or as you write down your prayers or you say your prayers, God does not audibly reply to what you've just prayed or said. Well, he does for Habakkuk. Habakkuk has a conversation with God, a heated conversation as Habakkuk confronts and accuses God, and then God graciously responds. Habakkuk had spoken, God replied, and now today, Habakkuk speaks again in response. And we find that Habakkuk no longer is saying, God, you're not doing anything. Okay? He now gets it. God is doing something. He protested for the first time that God was doing nothing. Now he gets that he's doing something, but he doesn't agree with what God is doing. We'll see it's as if Habakkuk is saying in our passage today, God, I see what you're saying, but I do not agree. I understand what you've said. I'm following you. I'm tracking with you, but I am not okay with it. I'm not okay with what you are doing. That's what we find in our text today. So the book of Habakkuk has not ended. Okay? Habakkuk didn't speak. God replied, and then Habakkuk says, I'm good with that. I'll accept that. But instead, Habakkuk goes for a second round of protesting God. So our section for this morning, as Judah said, where we get the words of Habakkuk, is Habakkuk chapter 1, starting at verse 12. We're going to go all the way down to chapter 2, verse 1. And our theme for this section is this. Habakkuk goes from protesting what God is not doing to protesting what God is doing. Habakkuk goes from protesting what God is not doing to protesting now what God is doing. So this week I want us to begin with the verses actually right before our passage. If you were with us several weeks ago when I began this study, I just glazed over the verses right before our passage this morning. Now I want to look at them more in depth as I believe they are key for understanding our text for this morning. So look back with me at Habakkuk 1, verse 6. Habakkuk 1, 6, God said this. Just consider the first couple words for the moment. Habakkuk 1, 6, for behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans. God says this, for behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans. The name the Chaldeans is another name for the Babylonians. Okay, the Babylonians. The name Chaldeans is used throughout Scripture as well as the name Babylonians, often referring to the same nation. God said, I am raising up the Babylonians. He's saying, I am sovereignly causing them to be established in this way. God was behind the Babylonians' rise to power, and he would work through them. This is what he was doing while Habakkuk thought he was doing nothing. God further describes this people. If you look with me at verses 6 through 11, I want to break down these descriptions. And the first way that they are described is that the Babylonians have an army that is fierce. It's rapidly moving. It works its way through the land, taking over city after city. If you look with me at verse 6, Habakkuk 1:6, God says and describes these people. He says, for behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans. And then here's the description, that bitter and hasty nation who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. So bitter and hasty, they are fierce. They are a fierce people. And then it describes them as making their way through the land fast, rapidly taking over cities. God continues to describe them. The Babylonians are a terrifying people who decide for themselves what is right and wrong. Look with me at verse 7. They are dreaded and fearsome. Their justice and dignity go forth from themselves. Just glance up at verse 4 for a moment. These were Habakkuk's words. In Habakkuk 1:4, this is what Habakkuk protested. He complained, and he said, "So the law is paralyzed, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted." So there was no justice in Habakkuk's society. Where he was living, there was no justice. There was no sense of holding up what is right and wrong. And now God is saying in verse 7 that he's going to meet this. He's going to meet this injustice, or this not holding up of justice in Habakkuk's nation. He's going to meet this with a nation who does not carry out justice as well, since they decide for themselves right and wrong. The Babylonians' army is described as a predator. Okay, just notice in verse 8 how God describes their horses and their soldiers as animals that rip apart, devour, and they quickly move on to the next animal to hunt. Look with me at verse 8 at this predator language. Their horses are swifter than leopards, more fierce than the evening wolves. Their horsemen press proudly on. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle, swift to devour. So they're like animals, attacking, hunting, devouring their prey. The Babylonians are determined to oppress and do harm to others. Look with me at verse 9. Habakkuk 1:9. They all come for violence, all their faces forward. They gather captives like sand. Again, thinking back to Habakkuk's original words, he cried out to God, violence. There's violence in my society. There's violence in my world, in my nation. And now God meets that with people that aim at violence. So God meets violence with violence. And further, God shows that they gather captives. There at the end of verse 9, it says they gather captives like sand. We know, or I think most of us know, 4 of the would-be captives of the Babylonians: Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So we put some names to these captives. The Babylonians are a fearless people. Look with me at Habakkuk 1:10 as God continues to describe. He says, "At kings they scoff, and at rulers they laugh. They laugh at every fortress, for they pile up earth and take it." So the Babylonians, they view no one as a match for them. Okay, they view themselves as on a whole nother level as they mock. Okay, we get these words, scoff and laugh again. They mock all these positions of power. They mock seemingly secure places, as we get this word fortress. They laugh at every fortress. As the Babylonians, they know how to handle it. They know how to conquer it. As that last line shows their tactic, it says, "For they pile up earth and take it." Okay, it speaks of their tactic or their strategy for attacking these cities of building up or pushing dirt to make a massive ramp to reach this city and to take over it. And as we think about this description so far, we get a powerhouse of a nation that's being described. We get a nation that is filled with pride that God is speaking about. And we see both of these things in the last verse, the last description. If you look with me at verse 11, we see the Babylonians' confidence lies in themselves. God describes them this way in verse 11. "Then they sweep by like the wind and go on, guilty men whose own might is their God." Again, and we've seen this in various verses here in this description, the speed with which they conquer. Okay, this is no slow-moving army, but they're quick, they're swift, they're effective. And further, they're labeled as guilty people, speaking of their sin, their evil. And further, they worship themselves. They rely upon their own abilities and tactics, as it says there at the end of verse 11, whose own might is their God. Which again, thinking about a little later in biblical history, a name that we know, I think, pretty well is King Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, it's either him or his father that are being talked about here by God, speaking of this nation coming. And we know the words of King Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 4:30 of this pride, of this worship of themselves. It says this in Daniel 4:30, King Nebuchadnezzar's words. "Is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my own mighty power as a royal residence and for the glory of my majesty. King Nebuchadnezzar was a prideful man, worshiping himself, seeing himself as all-powerful. And that's what God's describing about these people, the Babylonians. So God is describing for Habakkuk, he's describing what he's doing of using a pagan nation, a nation who absolutely did not worship the Lord. God describes them in all of these ways for Habakkuk. God shows that he was using this strong and strategic, but also this sinful and this sinister nation to reap havoc all over the land. And something to point out, which and we address this, I believe, slightly in our first week, but when is Habakkuk prophesying? When did he live? Okay, I want to point out, we find in this section, I think, a clue to this, and that is to consider the way in which God describes the Chaldeans. Okay, and if you just glance over these verses, the way in which he describes them seems to be describing a nation that is known. A nation that's known, a nation that is actively moving and warring while God is speaking with Habakkuk. A nation that Habakkuk would be aware of. If it was today, if it was a nation today, we'd probably see him on the news. We'd hear him talked about in other countries making their way through that country. God is not speaking of these Babylonians as something of the past, neither are they far in the future, but he is talking about a nation that is presently working, presently warring, and soon is going to be upon Habakkuk and his people. Okay, this clues us into the time period that Habakkuk is living and prophesying. We don't get many clues to this, but here, without looking at a lot of other passages due to sake of time, Habakkuk then most likely lived during or right after King Josiah's reign. Okay, so the godly King Josiah, Habakkuk very possibly lived during his reign, or definitely, okay, if it wasn't King Josiah's reign, he definitely lived during King Josiah's son's reign, which his name was King Jehoiakim. So he may have lived in a godly reign of King Josiah and King Jehoiakim's, or at the very least, King Jehoiakim's, which, as we think about the way in which Habakkuk describes his world, his society, his nation, violence, injustice, these describe King Jehoiakim's reign. And we know from biblical history that it's during King Jehoiakim's reign that the Chaldeans do come and they take over, or they begin to take over, the land of Judah. Okay, so as we consider verses 6 through 11, as I say, they're key. They're key to understanding our text. They're key to understanding what Habakkuk is thinking of God's answer. And as we think about Habakkuk's answer today, as we move into that answer, we're going to see that it doesn't sit well with Habakkuk, that it raises more questions than answers. So we'll move now to our passage. If you look with me at the start of verse 12, we see Habakkuk begins by declaring who his God is. So Habakkuk spoke, God answered, and now Habakkuk speaks again. We don't know how much time's in between, but Habakkuk replies to God, and he begins by declaring who his God is. Look with me at verse 12 at the beginning. He says, "Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die." So it's in the form of a question to start, but it's really a declaration. It's pronouncing what Habakkuk, how he views his God, and it starts with this word everlasting. Are you not from everlasting, which is a word that means from old. It's to describe God as being from the beginning, always existing, is what Habakkuk's declaring here. And further, with this word everlasting, the idea also seems to be in mind, not just that he's from the beginning, but to speak about God's involvement, God's work for his people, and quite possibly Habakkuk's drawing to mind when God led the people of Israel out of Egypt, as we get that name that God revealed at the burning bush to Moses, as it says, "Are you not from everlasting, O Lord?" Lord, that name Yahweh that God revealed at the burning bush, quite possibly Habakkuk's drawing to mind when God led his people out of slavery in the land of Egypt. So he declares him as everlasting. He uses the name Lord, but he also speaks of God as my Holy One. My Holy One, which is referring to the fact that God is distinct, God is separate, God is set apart from all other things. And then he goes on to say, we shall not die. So he declares things about God, and we're going to come back to some of those in a moment or a little later in our passage. But then he speaks about something for him and others. He says, are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. Habakkuk is saying that God will protect his people, that he believes that God will not allow his chosen people, Israel, to be wiped out. And notice the possessive language here in verse 12. Habakkuk says, my God, my Holy One. This is his God. This is what he believes about his God. This is the God who has been revealed in his word. And this start to the passage allows Habakkuk to have a real issue with how his God is acting. So he declares things that he has believed about his God, and now we're going to start to see how he deals with these, with what God has said. Move on in verse 12, and Habakkuk shows that there has been no miscommunication. If you look with me again at verse 12, he says, are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. And then he says this, O Lord, you have ordained them as a judgment, and you, O rock, have established them for reproof. So first I'd point out that we get to see again how Habakkuk views his God. Okay, he's spoken of him as my God, my Holy One, and now he calls him rock. In the last line of verse 12, he says, and you, O rock. Okay, this is purposeful language. This is language to say, I view you as my support, my defense. And second, in these last two lines of verse 12, we see it is abundantly clear to Habakkuk what God says he will do. Okay, so Habakkuk's not missing anything here. God had said he was raising up the Chaldeans, and Habakkuk, he takes this to mean that God is using the Chaldeans to punish the people of God. Habakkuk is saying the same thing in these two lines. If you look again at the end of verse 12, he says, O Lord, you have ordained them as judgment, and you, O rock, have established them for reproof. So he's stating the same thing over by speaking of God using the Chaldeans to punish the people of Judah. God has so determined and is sovereignly orchestrating the Babylonians to bring condemnation to the people of Israel, is what Habakkuk gets out of what God said. God is using the Babylonians as his tool of judgment. So I stress here that Habakkuk shows he gets it. Okay, there's no miscommunication. God didn't say one thing and Habakkuk took a completely different thing from that or misunderstood it. But Habakkuk takes in God's answer, and we find that as he processes this answer, he finds it to be an inadequate answer. An inadequate answer. When we find this full-blown starting in verse 13, as Habakkuk shows that he's not okay with what God is doing. Look with me at verse 13, and the first thing I'd point out is Habakkuk states how God is against all wickedness. He says this in verse 13, you who are of purer eyes than to see evil and cannot look at wrong. You who are of pure eyes than to see evil and cannot look at wrong. In verse 12, Habakkuk had spoken of God as my Holy One, which was to specifically speak of God's separation from sin and evil, that God was separate. God does not sin. He's distinct or apart from all sin and evil. And now Habakkuk states something similar by speaking of God's eyes, his seeing, his looking, which doesn't literally mean to observe or to know about sin, but rather when Habakkuk says here in verse 13, you who are of pure eyes than to see evil and cannot look at wrong, he's not talking about observing, but he's talking about condoning, tolerating sin and evil. God doesn't do this. And that's exactly what it seems God is doing in Habakkuk's view. As we see second, as we move to the second half of verse 13, Habakkuk asks how God could allow such things. Look with me at verse 13 again. He says, you who are of pure eyes than to see evil and cannot look at wrong. Why? do you idly look at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he? So I want to spend a little bit of time on this verse, as this just shows full-blown that Habakkuk's not agreeing with what God has just said. Okay, Habakkuk is very much so back to his protesting self here yet again. Habakkuk is back to his confronting, and as we look at verse 12, I'd say he's been gearing up to do this. He's been gearing up to get to this why question that he's already asked in verse 3. Why? Here he comes back to why. He's taking what he knows about God, what he believes about God, what he views about God on this hand. And then he's taking on the other hand what he's heard God is doing. And he's saying these two things don't add up. They do not mix. They do not correlate. They do not align. What I know about you and what you're doing do not align. Habakkuk has shown who his God is, and he's saying in this verse, God, this is who you are. Act like it. Act like it. Habakkuk uses graphic imagery. Okay, he attacks God. Okay, he already has attacked the ears of God. If you look back at verse 2 from our passage a couple of weeks ago, verse 2, he attacks the ears of God. He says, O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not hear? Or cry to you violence, and you will not save. Essentially saying, God, you're not listening. Your ears aren't working. He attacks God's eyes now in our passage. If you look at verse 13, he attacks God's seeing. He says, you who are of pure eyes, than to see evil, and cannot look at wrong. And then here's the real attack. Why do you idly look at traitors? So Habakkuk is saying, you are doing what you should not do. You are looking at what you do not look at. You are tolerating and even using what you are against. And then he attacks God's mouth. Attacks his ears, attacks his eyes, attacks his mouth. If you look again at verse 13, it says, you who are pure eyes and to see evil and cannot look at wrong, why do you idly look at traitors? And then here it is, and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he. You should speak up, God. You should speak up is what Habakkuk's saying, but you don't. Something awfully wrong is taking place, and you are not addressing it. You're not saying anything about it. You're staying quiet. So we see Habakkuk does not agree with how God is conducting himself. He's not okay with this. God is going against his character. And we also see here, as I said, we'll spend a little bit of time here in verse 13. The other thing I want to bring out is we see Habakkuk's nationalistic pride. Okay, or a pride for God's people. Look again at verse 13. He says, you are of purer eyes than to see evil, and cannot look at wrong. Why do you idly look at traitors and remain silent? And here it is, when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he. The wicked. Who's the wicked? The wicked, he's talking about the Babylonians. He's talking about these evil Chaldeans, these people God has described. And then, so he says, the wicked swallows up the man more righteous. Who's this man who's more righteous? He's talking about the people of Judah. And I'd point out to us, very interestingly, these are the people that Habakkuk began by complaining about the injustice and the sin and the evil of his nation, the people of Judah. Now he's calling them righteous compared to the Babylonians. That is who Habakkuk calls more righteous than the Babylonians, his own people who he had cried out about, spoke of the evil, and we might ask, are they really more righteous than the Babylonians? So we think about this dynamic. Habakkuk now kind of softening on his people. If you have siblings, maybe you could relate. Okay, if you have siblings, okay, and you'd say that you usually don't get along with your siblings, or if you think back to the days when you grew up with your siblings, you didn't often get along. You actually often saw each other as enemies. You fought. You got extremely upset at them and for the wrong that they had done. Maybe you punched them. Maybe you yell at them. You could be very hard on your brother and sister, just like Habakkuk's hard on his people for their sin, but back in his first protest. But if someone insults your sibling, oh no, they didn't. If someone harms them or hurts them in some way, you come to bat for them. You stand up and your anger is aimed not at your sibling anymore, but it's at that person as opposed to your sibling. That's what seems to be going on with Habakkuk. He now stands up for his people. His perspective on them changes a bit. He softens towards them. He's biased towards his nation and his people. Put yourself in Habakkuk's shoes. Okay, it's a pretty common thing to complain about the state of the U.S., the sin, the atrocities, the political landscape, abortion, racism. We complain. We want change for our nation. But what if we found out to judge our nation, God was going to send an enemy nation to it? That God would use that nation to defeat ours, to judge the sin of the U.S. Would you agree with that? Would you like that? Would that rub you the wrong way? I think we can get how Habakkuk feels about this, and he's not happy about it. But I'd ask, is he right to feel this way? Is he right to feel this way? In light of this, Habakkuk accusingly, so moving on to the next couple of verses, Habakkuk accusingly paints a picture of how the world seems from his point of view. So we're going to look at verses 14 through 16 as Habakkuk draws on the imagery of the underwater world. Okay, he accuses God of creating the world of human beings like the underwater world. Look with me at Habakkuk 1, verse 14. He says this, "You make mankind like the fish of the sea, like crawling things that have no ruler." Okay, did you catch the accusation? You make. The finger is pointed at God. You have made things as they are. You have made the world operate as I'm about to describe. God, you are to blame for this. Okay, what Habakkuk's going to describe is not a pretty picture. Okay, and he's starting right out, God, you're at fault. You're in the wrong for this. Moving on to verse 15, Habakkuk sees the Babylonians as having their way with mankind, just like a fisherman catching fish. Look with me at verse 15. He brings all of them up with a hook. He drags them out with his net. He gathers them in his dragnet. So he is talking about the Babylonians. Okay, it's relating this fisherman to the Babylonians. Habakkuk's view is that mankind is at the mercy of the Babylonians, just like fish are at the mercy of a fisherman. Large quantities are caught and taken away. They become captives and slaves of this wicked nation. Looking at the last line of verse 15, we see Habakkuk portrays the satisfaction of the Babylonians, just like a fisherman. It says this in Habakkuk 1:15, he brings all of them up with a hook, he drags them out with his net, he gathers them in his dragnet, so he rejoices and is glad. So just like a fisherman is excited and happy at his catch, the evil and the inhumane Babylonians are left to be excited and happy at their victory. Habakkuk speaks of the false worship of the Babylonians. Look with me at verse 16. Habakkuk 1:16. He continues on in this picture and he says, "Therefore he sacrifices to his net and makes offerings to his dragnet." So the Babylonians don't even worship God. They worship man-made items. They give credit to the wrong places, and yet they get to do what they want to do. Habakkuk shows the great gain that comes to the Babylonians, just like the fisherman at his great catch. Look with me at verse 16 again. "Therefore he sacrifices to his net and makes offerings to his dragnet, for by them he lives in luxury, and his food is rich." So from their evil exploits, from their plundering of people, they become rich. They get to benefit greatly from their lifestyle, from their power, just like a fisherman would from his catch. So have you noticed the contrast that Habakkuk is drawing out? Okay, how sinful of a nation the Babylonians are, and yet they reap great benefits. They have great freedom and power. They are left in the control seat. Meanwhile, the rest of humanity is left at their mercy. The injustice of this. How can God have made the world so corrupt and unfair? Well, Habakkuk ends this accusing picture by questioning, how long? We don't get those literal words, but he's essentially asking that. How long? And that's what he started with in his first protest. How long? He says this in Habakkuk 1:17. Is he then to keep on emptying his net and mercilessly killing nations forever? Is this to continue on and on? Just like a fisherman catches fish and he's back at it the next day. Is this how the Babylonians will be? That they will be able to continue their evil and their wickedness, crossing the countries victorious? Will this injustice continue on forever, is what Habakkuk's asking. When will this stop? Here as this section closes, Habakkuk is obviously not satisfied. His questions have not been answered, but he has more. We can see his fuming. We can see how he's puzzled. He has a real issue with evil in the world, and now he has an even greater problem on his hands as God speaks of how he's using it for his purposes. Our passage closes with a soliloquy. Okay, Habakkuk talking to himself. Habakkuk talks to himself, and we see he waits for an answer, but he also readies his own answer. Look with me at Habakkuk 2:1. I will take my stand at my watchpost and station myself on the tower and look out to see what he will say to me and what I will answer concerning my complaint. So the first 3 lines of verse 1 describe Habakkuk awaiting a response, okay, just like a sentry, just like a watchman in a city waiting. He's waiting for a response. Okay, he's gotten one before. Now he waits again for another. But we also get the curious line, last line in verse 1. He says, and what I will answer concerning my complaint. Okay, this is a line that gets various interpretations, but the one I feel fits the words and the context is that Habakkuk, in saying, and what I will answer concerning my complaint, is that he's saying that he will prepare how he will respond back to God when God answers him. Okay, he's preparing a response already. He hasn't gotten God's response, but he's preparing his defense. He's preparing. As he's called God into question, he's preparing now how he'll respond after God responds. Habakkuk here at the end of this passage is not backing down. Okay, he will not accept an answer that doesn't satisfy him. He's ready to keep on fighting God. So our section for Habakkuk today ends by anticipating a response from God, but also anticipating a response from Habakkuk. God is going to say more, but also it's anticipating Habakkuk's going to say more as well. So what can we take away from a passage such as this? What can we glean, or how should we live out a passage such as this? I'd first begin by saying, though Habakkuk is not an extremely familiar character, okay, neither is this a super familiar book of the Bible, Habakkuk, we continue to see, we saw it the first week, we see it this week, Habakkuk is a very relatable character, and this book is a very relevant book. Habakkuk's questions may be your questions. Habakkuk's anger may be your anger. Habakkuk's wrestling may be your wrestling. The question of evil and God's involvement is still a very common question and subject. And I believe the book of Habakkuk can be a real help as we consider this question. Habakkuk, as we think about him this week, Habakkuk thought he saw a contradiction between what he knew about God and what God was saying he was doing. Maybe you felt the same way. Habakkuk was looking at things from a very human perspective, okay? Especially as we think about him comparing humans to fish and how the Babylonians have this control. Maybe as you watch news, as you hear of wars, as you hear of tragedies, you struggle to only look at them from this human vantage point. And now we've seen all through Habakkuk's first and second protests that Habakkuk has a real issue with the fact that sin is continuing, and even now God is using it. And maybe you've been shaken by this type of thing. Why isn't evil just vanquished? How could God use it? This book and its primary character, along with God, speaks into our world and our lives today. And then the second thing I'll bring out is we by no means get all the answers. Neither can we understand it fully. It may rub us the wrong way, but we see here how the Lord works, how God can use evil and sin for his good purposes. Okay, we can think of the story of Joseph. I think that's a popular one in which Joseph answers his brothers who sold him into slavery. He speaks of God's involvement with sin, and he says this in Genesis 50:20. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So that was God taking evil and using it for the good, to provide for nations. And now we have here something different, God's sovereignty still, but God taking evil and using it to judge others' sins. God uses wicked people, sinful acts, horrible mistreatment, and war for his plans and for his purposes. This may rile us up like it did Habakkuk. This may make us a bit uncomfortable or even extremely upset like it did Habakkuk. But this is what God declares to him. How should we deal with and think of such things if we struggle with this act of God like Habakkuk did? Well, that leads to the last thing that I'll close with. As we think about application, and that really is the true application that we have for this morning as we get God's response next week. He tells Habakkuk how to respond. He shows what the takeaway is from all of this. He shows Habakkuk how he is to live in the midst of such a world of injustice and evil, a world and even a God and his plans that he doesn't fully understand. How should Habakkuk live? We get that next week. It's a game changer for Habakkuk and this whole entire book. So I'd invite you to join us next week, as it really is a part 2 to this conversation. We've gotten Habakkuk's words. Next week, we get God's words. Let's pray. Lord, the question of evil and sin in this world is an extremely difficult question and subject. It's something that holds people up. It's something that even as Christians we struggle with, and we try to figure out and we try to understand. And Lord, as we see Habakkuk's done exactly that, as he's experiencing extremely difficult things, Lord, as we experience extremely difficult things in our personal lives, in our world, Lord, I pray that you would help us to go to books such as Habakkuk, to study these, to look at these, to see how you answer them. And Lord, I pray that you would help us as we wrestle with these things. Help us to hold on to our faith as we see Habakkuk does. He still has a relationship with you. He hasn't turned from you. Lord, keep us firm in these times as we struggle with such things. Lord, I pray that you'd help us as we go into our weeks this week to live our lives for you. And in your name I pray. Amen.